On to the 115 charges, and we know they were dealt by the Premier League back in February 2023, now for allegedly breaching financial fair play rules over a 9-year period. They will be heading to court in the coming days, weeks. I'll let you tell us a bit more on that in a moment. It's slightly earlier than anticipated originally, this court date. It was originally mooted to sort of autumn time. We now know it's probably more likely to be this month in September. Where are we at with this, I guess, really? What do we know so far? I mean, the confidence levels from both parties, they both spent a lot of money on the legal battle, the legal case up until this point. So it does feel as though, Stefan, to not put too fine a point on it, though, that the biggest day in this Premier League campaign could well be coming nowhere near a football pitch.
Yeah, look, this is a massive case with serious implications, not just for this season, but I think really for the last few years of the Premier League. I don't think anybody would shy away from that, even including the two parties. In terms of the timing, look, we are basing all our timing assessments off, an article in the Times, which may or may not be correct. My understanding is that when these timings have been put to the parties, they haven't denied that these are the timings, i.e. September, but nobody's prepared to actually formally state when the hearing will take place and how long it will take place. And the relevance of how long it will take place is that you can tell a lot from the duration of a hearing in terms of the types of things that will be considered, and the sort of the seriousness of the deliberation that can be expected. But if we take everything on face value, we understand that the hearing will start this month, as you say, maybe even this week. I have heard one rumor that suggested that it would start on Friday. It is likely the first few days of the hearing will be reading days, because there will be a huge amount of information for the panel to consider just before both parties start with their opening statements, setting out their cases, and contained in what's known as written skeletons. So they will detail probably over 25 to 50 pages with reference to the key documents in the case, their position, both the Premier League and City, which the panel will then consider, and then we'll hear the evidence over the next few weeks. Now, it looks like what's going to happen is that case is going to run all the way through to the end of the year. The case won't have moved in the way that's been suggested. If a case like this will probably have something like 10 to 15 barristers involved, and those 10 to 15 barristers will have effectively had to block out of their diaries the final 3 months of the year. So this will have been set in place probably over a year ago, especially when you're dealing with some of the sorts of cases that are in place for both the Premier League and for City. So Adam Lewis on the Premier League side and Lord Panic on City side. And there are others. They're not the only cases. Both teams will have 2 to 3 cases each, and then junior barristers on top. So all of this has been set out some time ago. It's not this moving feast that's been suggested in the press. It will then be a very long hearing, which will then take the panel, frankly, quite a long time to deliberate on and to produce written reasons. And differently from the arbitration, because this is an independent commission, we will get a published decision. Richard Scudamore confirmed the same at the Premier League launch just a couple of weeks ago. And that is set out very clearly in the rules. We will get a full written decision, which will set out in the way that we saw with Everton and with Nottingham Forest in the PSR cases. It will set out all of the arguments that were made, all of the facts as they were set out. It will give us unbelievable insight into what's really been going on over the last few years. So it will be fascinating to read. But I should warn people, it's going to be between 200 and 400 pages long, probably. It will not be a simple document to pore over, and it will take some time for people to digest it. So, and importantly, contrary to what we've heard, I doubt it will appear in the very early part of 2025. I would anticipate that if this really does run from now until the end of the year, that the Independent Commission will need something like 3 months at least to deliberate and to write up its written reasons. Even before an appeal, we cannot expect this to be dealt with very early on in this season. And with an appeal, I would suggest that it's actually quite likely that it won't be dealt with in this current season.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that then. That seemed almost inevitable, doesn't it? And I imagine you would anticipate that both sides of this particular case would be looking to appeal whatever the outcome may be, were it not to go their way. I mean, is there any chance, Stefan, at all that when it comes to the sanctions, the potential sort of outcomes, is there any sort of deal to be struck here whereby they both walk away, shake hands and say, okay, we'll take that?
Yeah, so look, there are always possibilities to settle, and that sort of window doesn't close even when a trial or a hearing of this nature starts. That remains open. And frankly, it remains open even after the hearing is completed. It's not unusual in cases of this type, particularly in the outside world, in the courts, for the parties to come out of the trial and have a view as to how the trial has gone and how the hearing has gone, and to come to a settlement before we ever see a decision. Now, the issue that the Premier League and City have got is that can't apply in this case in very confidential ways, because what happens where you have a sanction agreement, as it's known in the Premier League rules, i.e. a settlement, is it has to be ratified by the independent panel. So the independent panel effectively has to say that the deal that's been done between the parties is sort of fair and reasonable. And that's going to be quite difficult for a panel to agree to if it's come to very sort of strong views one way or the other within the case. A sanction agreement would also require City to admit whatever it is outlined to effectively have accepted by way of breaches and therefore to be punished. And that feels, again, also quite difficult. Aside from one potential area, which is on the non-cooperation, you could see a potential scenario where City themselves would be prepared to settle only on the non-cooperation piece if all the other charges were dropped. Now, the issue with that, of course, is that just would not satisfy the outside world. So from a Premier League perspective, it's very unlikely that politically they could now, at this stage, agree to a settlement purely on non-cooperation and for everything else to go away. So I suspect that settlement is going to be very difficult, either now or going forward. And in terms of appealing by both sides, I think City will certainly appeal if it goes against them, aside from potentially on just a non-cooperation in the way that Cass found. The Premier League, I think it's slightly more complicated. I think the Premier League, if they were to lose, they will then have a very difficult decision as to whether they want to appeal and drag this whole thing out even further. I think there's a very good chance the Premier League will say it's been heard by a 3-man panel independently over a very long period. We now all need to move on. I don't think that will be the end of it politically for the Premier League, but I do think that it's likely that they will come under some pressure to move on and try and draw a line. Likewise, there will be pressure, of course, from some clubs to appeal and keep going, but it will need leadership and a drive to make sure that we can somehow move on. I think, particularly if City were to succeed in defending themselves, given how long this has been going on, I think City could, with some justification, expect to be permitted to move on with their lives, as much as that might be difficult for fans of Liverpool and all the other clubs. And I'm not just saying that as a City fan, and I think it's well known that I am a City fan, but I do try and be objective. But I do think that clearly, if City are found against, you can expect extremely severe penalties. But likewise, if the case is not proven, City must be allowed to move on.
On the Premier League side of things, Stefan, I wanted to ask you, because I wanted to ask you basically, have they acted smartly here and accordingly? Because I mentioned 115 charges. It's a very startling number. It's very eye-catching, that amount. Is there a world whereby perhaps they could have streamlined that a little bit and maybe just focus their attentions more on, I don't know, 10, 15, 20, as opposed to going for this grandiose, look what we're doing to Manchester City, aren't we great, aren't we getting our house in order? Would that potentially have made life slightly more easier for themselves?
Yeah, so I think there's two parts to it. The first part is, there's the headline of the 115, which actually is an underestimate of the number of individual rule breaches that are actually alleged. It's actually closer to 130. But my personal view is they set themselves off on the wrong basis on that. There was nothing to be gained by increasing the noise around the number of charges. when fundamentally it comes down to 5 broad areas of charge. And likewise, given the severity of the 2 main aspects of that in terms of the sponsorship side of things, I would say that they would have been better served concentrating on a smaller time period in relation to a smaller set of matters, but focusing purely on the most serious of those. But these are sorts of debates that happen all the time with legal teams looking to prosecute their cases in litigation. There are always things where you think, well, should we include that head of claim, or should we drop that one and concentrate on our strongest points? Typically, what does happen is that people focus on their strongest case and don't seek to get distracted in the trial process and in the hearing itself by matters that are weaker points and more difficult to prove. Now, it may be that the Premier League took a view that as a regulator of the Premier League, that they needed to effectively go after everything that they felt was a breach, and be that things that they felt were stronger and bigger breaches, or not. And what that's meant is that if the reports are to be believed, we've got an enormously long trial coming of 10 to 12 weeks, an enormous amount of evidence, and a real burden on the panel to make some very big decisions. So I think you could have a team of lawyers, you could have 20 lawyers here would tell you slightly different things about their approach. And of course, we haven't seen the papers. We haven't seen the evidence. We haven't seen how the parties are going to position their cases. But from the outside looking in, the case looks very, very complicated, excessively so, and that will lead to complications down the line and has led to longer time periods to get to this point, longer hearing, and probably a longer period between the hearing and the decision itself. So those are the consequences of going for everything. But it may be, as I say, as a regulator, you just don't feel that you have a choice in terms of cherry picking. You feel like these are the breaches. We've got to put them all to the Independent Commission, and the Independent Commission can decide.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. And like I say, I'm sure the Premier League believe they have got a watertight case for that, and Manchester City on the flip side feel they can defend against all of that as well. But yeah, I think in terms of just 115, it does sound like a hell of a lot of things to be right across, and like I say, it might confuse and muddle the thinking somewhat when it comes to the actual case itself. On the trial itself then, we're unlikely to get all the gory details, aren't we, really? Whenever it does start, whether it be this Friday coming or further down the line, it's unlikely to be played out in public, as much as I'm sure we'd all like it to be. And we'd have a gallery there of regular journalists watching and reporting on it on the daily. That isn't going to be how this works.
No, it isn't. And clearly it would be fascinating if we were to get the blow by blow. I think it would likely end up with lots of people dialing in. If this was something that was played out in the High Court, it would be public, and people probably would be able to get a Zoom link in the morning and would be able to watch it all day long. And you can imagine watching that for 12 weeks, what that would be like. We've all seen, we've seen American trials running for this sort of time, but look, it's not a normal thing to have a 12-week trial. Those are usually reserved for the more complex commercial disputes. And it will be hard going for the lawyers, and it would be hard going for people watching it, but it's all going to be in private. We are probably not going to get even updates as we go through, unless one of the parties decides to leak out how it's going for them. And even then, that's only going to be a kind of feeling. I mean, as you're in a trial, although the parties will have a feeling as to whether the panel is taking it on board, how it's going, you won't know for sure. And particularly where you've got a 3-man panel, 3-person panel, I should more accurately say. But, so if you're in a High Court trial, you've got one judge in front of you, you can start to sense how he or she is seeing the case, and and where they're sort of heading, and the sorts of questions that they're asking, both of the barristers and also maybe of the witnesses. When it's three people, it's much harder. So I suspect the parties won't know how it's gone, even after the end of the hearing. And so any feedback that we get in the press, I think you can discount heavily. And that's even if it's leaked. And I wouldn't expect high quality leaks, to be perfectly honest with you. I think we will, unfortunately, as hard as it is for people, we will just have to wait. When we get the decision, as I say, it'll be 200 to 400 pages long in all likelihood. People can pore over that detail. And then we'll have a much better view as to what happened, what the arguments were, how it panned out, and what the panel heard. But really, people are just going to have to wait, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, patience is the order of the day when it comes to this one. Last couple on this matter, Stefan, if I can. The crucial question, really, I guess, the reason we're all having these conversations, the potential punishments, the sanctions, I'm not going to ask you what they're likely to be because that's now impossible, but what is on the table, and I guess more importantly, what is not off the table here? Because backdated punishments potentially moving forwards, transfer bans, massive point deductions, is anything possible, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think transfer ban could only really come in place if, say, they made a finding that City, that none of the things were proven except for the Yaya Toure thing, and that they felt that the Yaya Toure thing was relatively minor. Because I think a transfer ban at the end of the day would be a very mild punishment for City. And I suspect that it's not one of the likely outcomes. I think the likely outcome, if everything is proven, is as severe as you can imagine. And we don't know exactly, because frankly, the Independent Commission has complete flexibility as to how it deals with the punishments. But the allegations are super serious, and therefore the sanctions will be super serious to go with them. There can be no question that if these allegations are proven, that two things. One, City have had a sporting advantage. I don't even think it would be arguable that if these things are proven, that they don't flow into sporting advantage. But moreover, they've got all sorts of aggravating factors, because they will have been found to have committed, effectively accounting fraud or accounting misrepresentation. So, and these are City's own words in the CAS hearing in terms of what the allegations amounted to. So I don't think anybody could suggest that the sanctions, if proven against City, the most serious matters, would be very, very serious. And but at the other end, on the non-cooperation stuff, if everything else fell away and only non-cooperation was in play for the Premier League, then I think you would look slightly differently at it and say, well, what's the sporting advantage related to non-cooperation? And you probably struggle as a Premier League to argue that there's been sporting advantage there. And without sporting advantage, if you were to look at the Nottingham Forest and the Everton PSR cases, it appears that without sporting advantage, it is probably not a matter for sporting sanction. So I would think there is a good chance that if everything that the Premier League put forward falls away, except for non-cooperation, City would argue very much for a financial penalty for just non-cooperation. And probably that would satisfy the panel, probably. But, we don't have any of the details. If there was some kind of aggravating factor to the non-cooperation, so it's hard to imagine what it would be. But if there was something and they felt that it needed to be particularly harsh penalty for that, then even then, I think it would be most likely just to be a bigger financial penalty as opposed to sporting sanction. So in simple terms, I would put sporting sanction down for the serious stuff and probably financial penalty down for the non-cooperation piece. And the other bits in the middle, I still think those things would end in some kind of sporting sanction, to be honest. The allegations are just that serious that sporting sanction for anything except for the non-cooperation seems likely.
Yeah.
If proven.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Just on that then, sporting-wise, would it... How much more complicated is it to backdate these punishments? Because obviously the sporting advantage that we're discussing here is played out over the last decade, more or less, really. And the stuff that they've able to gain that advantage doing and the stuff that they've won along the way has happened now. So does it make it murkier to sort of start stripping trophies and that sort of thing, as opposed to just doing here's your points deduction, this is what you're going to start on next season, for example?
Well, look, we're all, this is one area when you get to that point, so if you're sat in on the panel and the panel has established that all of the charges are proven, effectively the panel just becomes like every man on the street, and like you or I having this conversation. What's an appropriate punishment? Nobody knows, right? I mean, it's a blank piece of paper. We can all have our view as to what the appropriate punishment should be. Once you get to the point that everything is proven, practically you've got the same. We can all have a think about practically how it would work. We'd all know the problems. We might even understand the problems better than the panel, ironically. Because we understand football maybe better than the panel. Maybe some of the panel are not big football fans. We don't know. So maybe we'd understand the consequences of those punishments even better than they would. But in reality, they have a blank piece of paper. Both parties will make their submissions in terms of punishment. The Premier League will be very vocal on how they think the punishment should work if they are successful in the case. And the panel will just have to decide based on the submissions of the parties as to what is appropriate. But, I can say that there's no hard and fast rule here. If those charges are proven against City, the substantive ones, then we are in uncharted territory. And, we'll just have to wait and see. And in many ways, possibly the most likely area of appeal for City, if they were to fail at the commission, probably the biggest chance of success at appeal is probably not unwinding the findings of the Independent Commission, but actually it's about the sanction and appealing the sanction, because it's going to be very hard at the appeal for City to unwind findings of fact in the Independent Commission. So once the Independent Commission hears all the evidence and writes down that this is what happened in their view, after hearing all the evidence in person, City are going to find it very hard to unwind those findings. So it may well be that they're looking, as Everton did, and focusing very much on the punishment as opposed to the findings of the Independent Commission at appeal. So again, another interesting aspect. But look, it's all new, it's all unprecedented. There's not even good authorities for this stuff, So we shouldn't underestimate the challenge that the Independent Commission has here, and the panel, and whoever the three people are. They have an enormous challenge, not just in what they're hearing and understanding the case, but in making the calls that they're going to have to make against those individuals involved. And they're going to have to make some pretty serious calls against people as well as organizations, not just City, but also third parties. And then on top of that, in coming up with the sanctions, it's very much an unenviable position for the Independent Commission.
Yeah, it certainly is. Yeah, certainly. So when you factor in who we're dealing with here in terms of the size of the entities, but not only that, the outside parties looking in, and you've got Liverpool as one of the case in points on that. They'll be waiting with bated breath to find out how this goes, because not only does it impact what potentially has happened, but also moving forward to what happened next as well. So really, really interesting, really, really fascinating.